I'm so happy to have on the podcast today, returning is David Dayen. You know him as the executive editor of the American Prospect. Welcome back, David. It's always such a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Brianna.
And for the first time, Freddy Brewster, who's been reporting on similar issues over at The Lever. Welcome to Bad Faith.
Thanks, Brianna. Happy to be here.
So I said similar issues. The issue at hand is what's going on with the Trump administration in these first days and weeks. I've gotten a lot of feedback from the audience wanting some clarity on what is and isn't happening specifically with these executive actions. And both The Lever and the American Prospect have been doing a really exceptional job of tracking all of these things. Now, I want to start in perhaps a little bit of an unorthodox place, because I do think that a lot of the viewers of this, or listeners of this podcast in particular, have real questions, not just about what is happening, but about what they should understand and believe, given that the kind of overwhelming corporate traditional media environment is to be sort of running cover for the Democratic Party in this moment, as even the most loyal adherents to the Democratic Party are sort of tearing their hair out and asking themselves, why aren't the Democrats doing more? And I think responding to one of those sort of mainstream media outlets and how they're framing it might create an interesting frame for us to get into this conversation. So I wanted to start with this clip from Monday's episode of Pod Save America, in which they address a viral news clip from Bill Maher, in which sports commentator Stephen A. Smith lays out his vision of why he thinks the country ultimately voted for Trump and why there seems to be a lot more satisfaction on the right side of the aisle than the left. So let's take a listen. Feel free to stop it at any time. We're going to pause it after the Stephen A. Smith section to give us a chance to respond, and then get back into the Pod Save crew's analysis.
Here's the deal. The man was impeached twice. He was convicted on 34 felony counts. And the American people still said, he's closer to normal than what we see
Exactly.
left. That's what they're saying. He's closer to normal. Why? Because something that pertains, when you talk about the transgender community, for example, and you're talking about the issues that pertain to less than 1% of the population, the Democratic Party came across as if that was a priority more so than the other issues. And so he comes into office. Now you're talking about childbirth, citizenship, and what have you. He knows that's not going to pass the mustard, but he knows that he made that promise. So when he shows up week one on Capitol Hill and he says, this is what we're going to do through an executive order, even though it's going to be shot down through the courts and what have you, he's saying, I kept my promise. A lot of other things that he's going to point to that he's going to try to do, I kept my promise. Then you turn around and you look at the left and you say, what promises did you keep? Now, you might know the answer to that. I'm certainly not questioning your knowledge about that at all. What I'm saying is what resonated with the voter. What voter out there can look at the Democratic Party at this moment in time and say, there's a voice for us, somebody that speaks for us, that goes up on Capitol Hill and fights the fights that we want them fighting on our behalf. They didn't do that. And that's why their behinds are home, and that man is back into the White House, and they want to sit up there and talk. You look at the networks right now, they're talking about him. Look at it. This is the latest. Look at him. Here he goes again. Well, you know what here he goes again means? He's doing what he said he was going to do. He promised you he was going to do these things, and he walked into office week one, and that's exactly what he's doing. And he's saying, y'all do something about it. And when you try to do something about it, he's going to say, look at them now. Now they're concerned about these issues. Were they talking about that during the campaign? Hell no. That's really it.
Yeah. Well, yes.
All right. Any initial responses to Stephen A. Smith's sort of vision of the case? I'll start with you, Freddie.
Yeah. So, Stephen A. brings up, an interesting point where, he's talking about, Trump being willing to seem fighting for, the causes of his base, which is, true. Trump has largely been, that's one of, the admirable parts about when it comes to Trump is that he's willing to fight for whatever he says he's going to fight for, and he's willing to fight for his base. The Democrats, to, Joe Biden's credit, even though it was a bit half-hearted, he did try to fight for student loan forgiveness at the beginning of his administration. But a lot of those promises, really, really fizzled out there towards the end. The base was demanding, the ceasefire deal in Israel. And, they largely backed away from that. And then, like I mentioned, the student loan stuff, it's been kind of piecemeal and nothing, super substantive happened throughout the administration. So, Stephen does strike out a core point there that, Trump is unafraid to be seen fighting for his base, regardless of how it looks.
Yeah, Freddie, I might even go farther than you and say that he never fighted for the student debt program, that was something that was thrown out there as a kind of a campaign promise. But fighting implies going to the mat, taking an unpopular position, a position that might be unpopular with some parts of the country. To be clear, student debt cancellation was very popular, especially with Joe Biden's actual own base, which is why he levied it as a campaign promise, right? But when it came to trying to push through executive orders, the likes of which Donald Trump has done now, just in the first week or so of being in office, you see a really different sort of energy, almost like Democrats have been historically afraid of their own shadow, whereas Republicans have sort of the confidence of their belief system driving them to do things that might not even be frankly legal in order to deliver on these promises. David, I want to come to you now and maybe ask you this question in a different way and a bit more specifically. You know, Stephen A. Smith is alluding to promises kept. He specifically brings up the issue of transgender rights, but there's obviously been this defunding of DEI programs and other executive orders. Can you start to walk us through what people are thinking of, or what Stephen A. Smith might be alluding to when he does say Trump has immediately kept these promises?
All right. So Stephen A. made that comment on Friday. We woke up Monday and learned that the entire federal government is pausing all grants and loans through the Office of Management and Budget indefinitely pending review. What we learned today, this is Tuesday, is that all state Medicaid portals have been shut down. So anyone going to the ER that has Medicaid right now is likely going to be turned away because the state Medicare portal cannot figure out whether or not they actually are covered. I don't remember the Republican, position that they took that they were going to shut down all of Medicaid, all of it, which is what they're doing right now. I don't remember the position they're going to shut down all grants made to businesses, the entire program of foreign aid that we do in this country, the entire program of domestic aid and grants to community health centers, which are largely in rural areas, which are all going to be shut down if these grants are not produced. In the Trump era, I find that it is better to wait a minute before making grand pronouncements. It is not the case that everything that Donald Trump has said he was going to do is what he is carrying out. There are a lot of unintended consequences. What he is doing through this pause is actually very calculated. We wrote about it 6 months ago. It's designed to trigger a Supreme Court action so that Donald Trump can take control of the spending power away from Congress and decide on his own what he wants to spend money on and what he doesn't. It is extremely authoritarian. It is violating the Constitution, federal law, and Supreme Court precedent all at once. And it is sort of dead serious in terms of what is actually happening. We can talk about 100 other executive orders that he's done, some of which don't matter at all, but that one matters a heck of a lot. And it's designed to essentially delete Congress as a partner, co-equal branch of the U.S. government. So, we can talk about Stephen A., but you got to wait and see what this guy actually is intending to do.
Well, dude, help me understand the gravity of this. You're saying that you wrote about this 6 months ago and that you believe it's designed to trigger a Supreme Court decision that will enable the Trump administration to have more permanent power.
Yeah,
help me understand.
Let me explain it. It's there's a concept known as impoundment. Basically, since 1974, for the last 50 years, the U.S. government has operated on the principle that if Congress appropriates funds to the president's job is merely to execute that law faithfully and to appropriate those funds. The president can't say, you know what, I don't like DI programs. This might have been appropriated, but I'm not going to spend that money, and I'm just not going to do it. That is illegal. First of all, Congress has the power of the purse, so inherently speaking, that is illegal. In 1974, in reaction to Richard Nixon trying to do this multiple times, Congress overwhelmingly passed, and Nixon was forced to sign, the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which sets out very strict parameters for when a president wants to rescind spending. Those parameters are not being met in any way. This is a blanket attempt to pause all federal grants and loans. It's being done because there's a radical faction of the Trump administration, including the incoming head of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought, who believes that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. They think the Supreme Court is going to side in their favor. And they think that it is okay to say that appropriations are more suggestions than the law, that they are a ceiling and not a floor. And if the president wants to spend less than what's in an appropriation, they're allowed to do so. This is not in accordance with our history. It's not in accordance with the law. And it's an attempt to engage in a power grab such that if you are a Democrat in Congress and you're trying to do a budget deal with Republicans and the president in this moment, and you're being told that actually the president has the power to anything that you put into the budget, he can just not spend money on. Why would you do any deal with this individual who has ultimate power over whether something gets effectuated or not? It is an attempt to essentially disband Congress. It's that serious.
Yeah. So I have heard, obviously, people talking about how this funding freeze is illegal, how it's unconstitutional. But your point is sort of, yeah, he knows, and that's the point. And he's hoping that this, or maybe fairly confident that this conservative Supreme Court will back him up and then make this what is now illegal act, in fact, a part of our law and a part of our precedent. That is scary. But so go ahead. I want to please elaborate if you like.
I mean, that's generally the point. And if a president has a problem with federal spending, he has the ability to veto an appropriation. That is the way that he gets involved in the budgetary process. He can't, after the fact, get a second bite of the apple and say, okay, I signed this into law. This is the budget. But you know what? I'm not going to spend the budget. I'm deciding, I'm going to pick and choose what matters to me more in a budget. You can see how that is a radically different interpretation of our system of government than we've had in the past.
Well, especially because, I mean, the argument goes, and I'd love to hear you both respond to this. The argument goes that it is so much easier for Republicans to sort of get their way, whether we're talking about budget ceiling conversations, any kind of funding conversation, because Republicans want to make the government smaller. They want things to not be spent. They want the government to not work. And so they always are at a strategic disadvantage with respect to leverage over Democrats. And this seems to be sort of, in some ways, the apotheosis of that even if Democrats, in conjunction with Republicans, or because they have majorities, are able to pass these spending bills, that if the president, if a Republican president ultimately can say, well, never mind, I'm not going to allow the spending to go through, then there's really no point in having, frankly, Democratic majority in Congress if you don't have
or
the power
Congress
of the
at
president.
all. And I'm sorry, Freddie, I want to bring you in as well. But the bigger issue is that you could never imagine the converse of this being true. You could never imagine a Democratic president coming in and saying, you know what? I'm going to cut the defense budget in half because I now have this power granted to be by Donald Trump in the Supreme Court to say, I'm going to choose which parts of the federal budget I want to actually spend money on. And, I don't think we need an $800 billion defense budget. I don't think it's important to me. So I'm just going to cut it. Now, could you ever in your wildest dreams imagine a Democratic president saying that and carrying through on it? So one of the reasons why this is being perpetuated and that even Republican members of Congress are like, yeah, go for it. Why not? Is that they don't fear the converse ever being true.
Well, this is my question, David. Do you feel that that's the case because Democrats are basically spineless and feckless? Or do you think it's the case because there is some like legal prohibition from them doing so? Because I think the frustration, and I think what resonates for me about what Stephen A. Smith is saying, even though I don't share his political priorities, is that it does feel like when we're going back to this idea of a fight, that even when Democrats have tools at their disposal, they're unwilling to use them. And it needed to use them for good. I don't think a Democrat would ever cut the military budget in half because they're funded by the same defense industry that funds the Republican Party and all these other kinds of reasons. The question is, yeah, like, and that's an important question to answer when people are starting to try to attribute blame in this moment for how much Democrats are fighting back and how much Democrats basically set us up for this kind of ratchet effect that we're living in now, where there's only a swing in one direction and it's to the right.
Go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly believe that the Democrats are spineless and feckless, and just lack the willingness to actually do anything that is generational. I would say, Republicans are unafraid to stand by their morals, drive things down like the opposition's throat, and take chances. Like they may go to the Supreme Court and lose. It's like Trump's trying to do the birthright citizenship like executive order. He doesn't really care if it's shot down. It most likely will be, but at least he's trying it. And then you don't see that from the Democratic Party as much. They're like too invested in norms and too invested in the whole decorum of how everything works, that rather than actually getting things done. And so, it was it was extremely frustrating 4 years to see, a president who promised some sort of progressive change at times just to sit on his hands and be like, well, I don't know, what's it called? The Senate parliamentarian said that we're not allowed to raise the minimum wage, so we can't do it. Sorry. Whereas, the opposition party is more than willing to fire that person and get a new one in. And then also like I guess that Senate parliamentarian fight, those are recommendations. That person doesn't have power. Those are just recommendations for the Senate to follow. But, they decided to follow them. And that is in my opinion, the best example of the Democratic Party was that stupid parliamentarian fight in, 2022.
100%. I think that's such an important point. In 2021, I believe it was almost immediately at the beginning of Biden's term, did they do that little dance around the $15 minimum wage not being included in the COVID relief bill. All that being said, though, I want to come back to this point that you made, David. When I asked that first question about promises made, promises kept, I think you made a really important point that in addition to what Donald Trump campaigned on, he is doing things that he did not telegraph to the public he would do. I think probably because they are unpopular even among his base, because they're very dangerous, right? The Medicaid freeze, the implications for student debtors, all of the ways this is spiraling to affect many, many folks who voted for Donald Trump and who are now maybe potentially realizing that they are being negatively impacted by that. All that being said, I think it's an important point to make. Certainly the Democrats should be making that point very, very loudly. But all that being said, it does also seem like there are a lot of promises that he did make, that he is telegraphing he did keep, and that frankly, the messaging battle is over whether he can keep people focused on promises made, promises kept, and the extra stuff that people didn't bargain on. And I think my perception is that Democrats fail in part with their messaging dynamic because they spend a lot of time saying, oh, Republicans are doing these bad things that they weren't supposed to be doing, and not focusing enough on their affirmative achievements that are genuinely significant, as opposed to these kind of like means tested around the edges style programs that they hope that will linger in people's hearts and minds, kind of unrealistically, I think. So I just want to run down a couple of these. PolitiFact did a rundown of promises kept by Donald Trump already. They mentioned that he pardoned people convicted of crimes related to January 6th. He left the Paris Climate Accord again, commuted the sentence of Silk Road website operator Ross Ulbricht. Lovely. That he is obviously defunded these DEI programs. Freddie, you mentioned this attack on birthright citizenship. There have been commitments already secured from both Canada and Mexico to strengthen the border, and on and on and on, right? So I want to give you both an opportunity to sort of speak to what you believe are sort of these big ticket items that Trump is frankly championing right now as successes very early in the game, and how troubling those are for you. I'm not going to ask you to rank them worst to best, but what should people understand is going on right now?
Well, you can fall things into a few different buckets. I mean, one way to think about it is pardons, purges, and pauses. So there's obviously been these pardons, which has been maybe the most high profile. And it's not just the January 6th protesters, and it's not just Ross Ulbricht. There were pardons of people who were accused of violating what is known as the FACE Act, which is illegally obstructing the attempt by individuals to get abortion services. That is actually a violation of federal law, obstructing the entrances of abortion clinics. So he pardoned a bunch of people on the day of Roe v. Wade anniversary, which has become a cause célèbre day of rallies and stuff on the right. So the pardons, I think, have hurt him politically a little bit. We're starting to see, I guess one of the individuals, several of the individuals are sought on other crimes who were pardoned. So they come out of jail and they're actually being picked up again on separate crimes that have nothing to do with January 6th. So that's one side. And then you have the purges. There are many ways in which federal employees are being fired, set aside, programs are being overhauled internally, particularly around DEI, but not limited to DEI. Also, there's a vengeance component of this, where Justice Department officials who had a hand in the prosecution of Donald Trump have all been fired. The head of the Coast Guard was fired. The head of the TSA was fired. The general counsel of the NLRB and a member of the NLRB was fired. This is another interesting thing about the difference between Trump's words and actions. So an individual member, Gwen Wilcox of the NLRB, was fired, bringing that board down to only 2 people. And that is not a quorum. And what that means, based on Supreme Court precedent, is that the NLRB cannot decide any more cases. As long as they only have 2 members on the 5-member board, they can't decide any cases. So if you are a worker who was fired illegally for union activity, you actually cannot get your back pay because the NLRB can't make a decision in that. If you're a union that successfully engaged in an election and won an election, and the management disputes it, you can't get a ruling right now. If you file an unfair labor practice and it goes up the chain, you can't get a ruling right now. So you've essentially nullified labor law in the United States because of this purge. This is also illegal, by the way. It's another way where they're triggering, trying to dare a Supreme Court to change the law. The ruling is called Humphrey's Executor, and it under the current statute, the NLRB members cannot be fired unless they have engaged in malfeasance, essentially. And instead, Trump just fired this individual who was serving on the board to create this stalemate. Now, what we heard a lot during the campaign is that Republicans are a workers' party, that even the Teamsters supports Donald Trump, or supports the placement of his labor secretary. But here you have Donald Trump on the advice of very wealthy individuals who are either members of his cabinet or part of his inner circle, ending labor law in the United States, at least for now, until such time as there's an actual quorum on the NLRB.
Just a follow-up question, David. We had Eric Blanc on recently, and he was talking about that Democratic Party mistake. I don't know how else you characterize it. Right before Biden left office, where they had an opportunity to secure a majority on the NLRB enforcement board, and just screwed the pooch, just didn't have the people in the chamber to have the votes. Is this related to that at all, or could that have?
No. Well, I mean, two things. I think this makes that completely irrelevant because he just fired the person who was on the board. So if you would have put Lauren McFerrin on the board in December, which I agree should have been done, he would have just fired her too. Like that's the whole point here, is that Trump acted outside the bounds of the law to try to get the law changed to nullify labor law in the United States. As far as what was claimed in that particular circumstance, it gets a little wonky, but there are actually 2 votes when you vote for an individual to become a nominee, to confirm a nominee. One is the vote to end debate, and the other is the actual vote. The thing that they were voting on, where they thought they had a window to get it past Sinema and Manchin, was just the first vote. So there was this theory that, well, if they just would have quickly done the vote and not waited for Joe Manchin to show up in the Senate, then they could have got this done and she would have been on the board. Well, no, because that was the first vote. They would have got the first vote done. They would have ended debate, but Manchin could have shown up for the second vote, which they would have had to take to formally complete the confirmation of Lauren McFerrin. And all of this is a moot point if Donald Trump can willy-nilly just fire anybody in the federal government that he wants, regardless of whether they're confirmed or not. So unfortunately, we're playing a bit of Calvin ball here, where Trump is kind of making up the rules as he goes. And the check on that is a Supreme Court, 3 of the members of which he put on and installed on the bench, and 3 of the other members of which are staunch conservatives. So we may be in a bit of a sinkhole here in terms of, I know you want to get accountability for Democrats on some of these matters. And look, I certainly am not going to be sitting here and uniformly defending them. But if you have a essentially lawless other side, which is willing to engage in whatever and whenever to nullify Democratic advantage, then I don't know what the recourse is outside of some of the things. I mean, I think Democrats are kind of lurching to life. Unfortunately, it takes forever, but especially around this pause in federal grants and loans, they're starting to say, we're going to shut down the Senate. And there are ways that Democrats can actually do that. But it's a difficult thing. I mean, Donald Trump is what he's doing is fairly unprecedented.
Okay, I want to come back to this question of, Democrats lurching to life and what that looks like and what they're actually doing, because I have some questions about that. But to this, going back to something that you said earlier, David, again, promises made, promises delivered. I mean, the very fact that that Republicans can act so boldly and apparently without any impunity, with impunity, without any checks and balances, is because they also put in the work during the first Trump administration to build the Supreme Court of their dreams, which was also facilitated by a kind of fecklessness and irresponsibility from the Democratic Party in the stepping down of left-leaning judges, liberal judges, and a kind of hubristic actions of RBG, right? Which have this weird parallel in Joe Biden and his decision to stay in the race until the 9th inning. And so it feels difficult. So what you're saying is true. Like, obviously, that there are limits to what the Democrats could do. There's limits to whether or not, the NLRB mistake in last month in December would have made a difference in this moment. But the fact that Trump can fire this person to begin with, and that the Democrats behaving well wouldn't have made a difference, is all because the Republicans laid the foundation for this at a time when Democrats also should have been fighting back, and Democrats also should have been more strategic. And by the way, I think it was Sheldon Whitehouse who did this analysis, or maybe not. I remember it was back when I was reporting at The Intercept. Some analysis was done looking at when federal judges across the country step down Republican versus Democrat appointments, and that Republicans on the whole are strategic about stepping down or going into retirement so that Republican presidents can make the appointments to replace them. whereas Democrats just hang out until they die.
Yeah.
And
That's
give
sometimes
over
true.
time
That's not
strategic
always.
advance.
That's not always
Well, no,
true.
no, it's over the aggregate. The analysis
in
was
December, it looked as if certain Democratic appointees of Biden weren't going to get through. And so as a result, Democratic judges who were going to step down under Biden actually reversed themselves and said, no, I'm going to stay in place. I think the environment's getting a little better on that front. I think that, but look, I mean, Democrats made a lot of mistakes going back 40 years that they're getting basically hit with here. And what we're realizing is that the government itself has operated on a series of, I would say, gentlemen's agreements. That as long as you don't have someone who's willing to play that game and abide by that agreement, you can do a lot of damage. And I think Donald Trump has figured that out. That one of the main things that you see as a through line throughout these executive orders, in addition to paying back various constituencies, is all of the things that hampered me in the first term, I'm going to do away with in the second term. Some of that is personnel at the bureaucratic level of agencies that disrupted some of his actions in the first term. There's this thing called Schedule F that was put forward that enables the president to fire a greater number of federal employees who previously had civil service protections. So that's getting rid, sort of at that level, of those hindrances. Democratic appointees on commissions, let's just fire them. Let's challenge the law that says you're not allowed to do that. At least it'll create some upheaval. So that gets rid of that constraint, and so on and so on down the line. So I think you can read a lot of these early actions as attempts to basically break the chains of this. And, a lot of this comes right out of a playbook that they helpfully wrote down, 900 pages of which were poured over by reporters and presumably policymakers for the last year. It's called Project 2025. All of these, the vast majority of these executive orders come right out of that, whether they have unintended consequences or not.
Freddie, I want to bring you in on this because, of course, you just wrote this piece for The Lever titled Trump's First Orders Parrot Project 2025 Manifesto He Disavowed. How closely aligned are the orders that we're seeing from Trump with Project 2025?
Yeah, we looked at just his first day executive orders. He's been here for a little over a week now. In those first day executive orders, he signed 26 of them, and 16 are like straight out of Project 2025. David mentioned Schedule F. That's mentioned in the Project 2025 blueprint. We were talking about Russ Voigt, at the Office of Management and Budget. He wrote a chapter in Project 2025 for the Executive Office's Vice President. Brendan Carr, Trump's a nominee for the Federal Communications Commission. He wrote a chapter in Project 2025 about how to, change that entire, agency itself. This is like a broad, sweeping, blueprint that's like a corporate-backed blueprint. Some of these things in here are, quite radical, like the whole Schedule F stuff. Other things are kind of standard, conservative, like boilerplate, talking points, such as, rolling back environmental protections, the long-time goal to open up Alaska to, more oil and gas drilling. But so this is just like a long time effort, and this really shows. We had talked about the Republican plans, for like the Supreme Court and everything else, and like how they tend to be like more of a well-oiled machine rather than the Democratic Party. It's like they have these long established think tanks behind them. You have the Federalist Society, which pretty much like handpicks Supreme Court judges, and you have the Heritage Foundation, which has been integral into conservative politics since the Reagan administration, especially when it comes to policy. And each time a Republican's in office, they lean on these organizations for recommendations on whether it's policy or who to put in charge.
Yeah, I mean, everything that you're both saying has me reflecting on this sort of historical touch point that we come back to over and over again on the show, which is the Powell memo and this idea that there was a frankly explicit plan set into motion in the early 70s that the Republicans have been following very systematically and very openly to get to this point. Which is why the arguments about Democrats being feckless and caught off guard, they're very frustrating, right? Because you saw the agenda setting. You saw a reaction to the progressive movements, the labor movements of the 30s and 40s, the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, the women's lib movement of the 70s, and Republicans saying, oh, snap, let's get our act together. We're losing this popular war. How do we remedy this? We're going to start to build a foundation for a conservative media ecosystem that comes into fruition with Fox News and like the 90s. This is not like an always existed sort of a thing. That they say we're going to start a recruitment and training program for conservative ideology to take over the legal system called the Federalist Society. And they effectively train up generations of law students, judges, and et cetera, that can make their way to the Supreme Court and reliably deliver on these promises. And so now we have this world where I would argue, yes, Trump is a sort of a bizarre generational talent, but also he has the backing of a media ecosystem that is hook, line, and sinker behind him. He has the courts behind him. And that is what is enabling him to break these gentlemen's agreements. It's not that I can even just imagine that Joe Biden could have done the same thing. I think he would have faced opposition, both because Democrats like to follow rules and because he didn't have the infrastructure to actually back him up. So tell me what you think the Democrats could be doing in this moment. What's available to them in this moment?
Well, just as there are attempts and abilities to obstruct from the minority party when you're minority party and you're the Republicans, the Democrats have all of those same tools at their disposal. You might remember Tommy Tuberville basically engaging in hundreds of holds on defense officials, mainly generals or people who needed promotions, military promotions, by saying, I'm not going to promote any of those people until you change abortion policy. And I don't think, and this was abortion policy at the Defense Department, to be clear, I don't think he ended up actually getting that change in place, but he held them up for months and months and months. And there are just many obstructionist tools that any single senator can take to say, all right, as long as Trump is going to do this, where he's blocking Medicaid payments and blocking all of these things, I'm going to shut the Senate down. And there have been finally some, I think today literally is the first day of any kind of resistance to these kinds of actions that have been taken. You saw Senator Elizabeth Warren, for example, say that we're not going to agree to anything in the Senate. The Senate operates on the principle of unanimous consent. Any one senator that says, no, actually, you're going to have to read the whole bill, or no, you're going to have to, you're not allowed to hold committee meetings because I don't consent to the allowance of holding committee meetings. Or, I'm going to make a quorum call to make sure that every single member of the Senate is on the floor before we proceed with business. You can essentially stop the Senate from doing anything if you're determined. I think we're nearing the point of the kind of 4-alarm fire, which would get some Democrats to do that. And one of the reasons is they feel like they're in an advantageous position. When you see Meals on Wheels patients not getting their food, when you see SNAP recipients may be affected, when you see Medicaid patients affected, this is the kind of territory that Democrats fight on and win. I mean, Democrats do win certain fights in Washington, and they're usually around these types of things. When the vulnerable and needy are basically taken a gratuitous shot at, Democrats kind of know how to elevate those stories and get Republicans to back off. So I think that's what they're going to try to do.
You're nodding, Freddie. Do you have anything else to add to that before I sort of try to complicate it a little bit?
I just, Yeah, just one thing real quick, and it's just more of like a hot take. It's more, like, while this is going down, Democrats are on, Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, posting millennial cringe, like they did throughout the
100%.
first, like they did throughout the first Trump administration. And,
Yeah.
they also elevate just like, the most just old, near senile people ever to like key committee positions. And I'm thinking of AOC losing the seat to Jerry Conley, which,
Right.
correct me if I'm wrong, they're on the oversight committee, which oversees inspector generals or inspectors general. And, Trump
Part of the
fired 18 of
purge.
them
Yeah,
yeah, Trump
17
fired
inspectors general were fired. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so, the Democratic opposition to this is a 70-something-year-old man with throat cancer who hasn't really done any TV hits about how this is going to affect the country. And so, that at its core, in my opinion, is one of the largest problems in the Democratic Party is the gerontocracy that's ruling it.
Yeah. I
Well,
mean,
look,
I'm glad you go ahead, David. Yeah.
no, I mean, I feel like I'm being pushed into a position that I don't want to be pushed into of being
What
somehow
position
a
is that?
defender of the wondrous abilities of Democrats to fight back. Hakeem Jeffries, in response to this pause on federal payments, called an emergency meeting, and he called it for tomorrow. That doesn't seem like an emergency to me. if you're,
Yeah. What's
let's give us a day to think about this, and then we'll have the emergency meeting. Yeah, I mean, are we riding? Are Democrats sort of riding into town with those who are best equipped in this moment to fight back? No, of course not. But I think that it's interesting that you're starting to see a little bit of backpedaling. I mean, these things change from moment to moment, but you're starting to see a little backpedaling by the Trump people. They said, "Oh, these Medicaid portals that are all down, that's a separate issue, and we're going to get those back up right away." I mean, they're starting to. I think a lot of what Trump does is he pushes at that boundary just to test it. He pushes at those boundaries where people haven't gone before. And if they give way, then he goes through them. But if there's a little bit of a pushback, he's like, all right, I won't push that border anymore. Maybe I'll push this boundary. And
Right.
I think that's a lot of how he operates. And and what that demands in the moment is forceful pushing back around the boundaries rather than let's just all focus our efforts on the price of eggs, like Democrats have been doing,
Right.
give up this X, Y, Z, and Q and just focus on one thing, or focus just on this looming tax fight. That's not the way that you're gonna sort of get Trump in a position where he's in a defensive position. He's going to push those boundaries, and when he finds one that gives way, he's going to go right through it.
Yeah, Democrats have, as you just alluded to, been tweeting a lot about, I thought the price of eggs was supposed to go down, not up. That's very much a Hakeem Jeffries tweet. Hakeem Jeffries got dragged across Twitter a couple of days ago for his response to all of Trump's executive orders and all of the craziness that's been going on by tweeting, "Presidents come and presidents go. Through it all, God is on the throne."
Right. Right.
Like, it's giving slow clap. It's giving, this is your response to the guy that you told us was a fascist dictator. You got Elon Musk, Heil Hitlering on the screen.
That's the problem,
And
Bree.
what? Go for it.
The problem really is that Democrats build up this narrative of the end of democracy is nigh if Donald Trump gets in, and then he gets in, and they're like, I'll still be able to go to church on Sunday. So that is the bigger problem, is this willingness to go apocalyptic around election time and then just treat it all like it's kind of a game after that. That's what I object to.
I completely
absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, yeah, it's absolutely. It's like we had, whatever it was, like the whole campaign cycle, like 2 years of, Democrats and, their media allies saying how this is like, Trump's a fascist, Trump's, gonna, usher in like the fall of America. And yet here we are. And then, is their strategy just to let, shit hit the wall and try to clean it up afterwards and say, look, this is what got voted in, we're here to fix it? Or is their strategy to, actually offer some sort of opposition right now in the time? It seems to be just sitting on their heels and allowing everything to kind of like blow up in their face for a bit, and maybe come back in a couple months and be like, like, we knew this was going to happen. Here's our proposals on how to fix it. But that's not really like a strong message to people. Definitely not a strong message to your base, who, they're your base. They're going to be there voting for you. It could be a strong message to the people who, were, probably, tired of Joe Biden, wanted to change, so they voted Trump back in. But, it's a pretty ineffective message, and it looks horrible, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's what's been kind of interesting to watch some real Democratic acolytes start to get a little green pilled, I don't know, like wanting to break away from the Democratic Party. Maybe that's like, I'm overstating it, but a bunch of folks who have these tweets where there's a big roundup like, well, I am such a supporter of the Democratic Party and I was really there for Biden and then Harris to the end, but I gotta say, I expected a little bit more resistance. Like, I gotta say, I'm pretty disappointed. And that feels like for the sake of left politics, an important crack to sort of try to open. But if it is in fact true that the Republican Party has done such an airtight job of getting to this place where the resistance really is futile, not to be a total Trekkie in this moment, then I don't know what that's what I'm trying to kind of pry at. What should the expectations be of what's done now? And if they're sort of outside of a legislative, like traditional political context, well, should we be scrutinizing the extent to which Democrats have held hands with these sort of tough on crime Republicans to ratchet up penalties for civil disobedience, to ratchet up penalties for protest, to hit bail funds against for people protesting Cop City with RICO charges, and all of the things that they've done to make it more difficult to protest pipelines and all the environmental protesters, all of these things. Should we be focusing on that stuff in addition to what could traditionally happen through congressional means, and asking the question, why have Democrats basically bound their own hands by opening the door to fascism when they thought they were going to be the ones controlling the levers of power?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime I see something come up where it's a Democrat demanding that something be done, I just toss it aside. I mean, there are going to be lawsuits. There are already lawsuits against the main action that we've been talking about, which is the pausing of federal funds. Trump welcomes those actions, right? Because many of his inner circle believes that he's going to win that fight. There are also one thing we haven't talked about a lot is immigration, and the rollout, which is a lot slower than I think people expected, of mass deportations. It's starting to ramp up now as we get to the second week. However, there are cities around the country. Chicago comes to mind as really the big one where, and I believe Trump's deportation czar, Tom Homan, was on television just recently whining essentially that Chicago activists knew what the law was, both locally and federal law, to force avoidance, to avoid deportations for undocumented individuals, to contest ICE trying to come into spaces without a warrant, et cetera, et cetera. The sort of know your rights kind of stuff. And we are seeing pockets of that across the country, both in conjunction with activists and also unions who employ a lot of workers who are under threat at this moment, and even mayors of cities and things like that. So there's a different it's a different kind of resistance. It's not, the people with pink pussy hats and in the streets and stuff like that. But there are things going on. They're at more of a litigation level. They're at more of a level of fighting individual deportations through the mechanisms of the law. That's not a really satisfying answer. And I don't think it should end there, but it's the first step of what's being done. But I do think that a lot of sort of the kind of people who would go out into the streets are the kind of people who said, well, you know what? I did that 4 years ago. I thought we had won this fight. I went to brunch, and now I got it. You're telling me I got to do this all over again. People like almost exhausted by the fact that democracy requires a constant vigilance, which I think is problematic. I mean, maybe it's the instant gratification era, and we don't have that sort of understanding that these things take a constant amount of action. I'm wondering what you two think about it, but it seems to me that the exhaustion is coming from there.
I have a little bit more of a cynical take on it, but go ahead, Freddie.
Yeah, I think one of the main things Democrats could do would be to take a strong stance against cryptocurrencies. And they've decided to cozy up to that industry. I know it's a bit of a sidebar here, but Trump has promised to make the U.S. the crypto capital of the planet, and the Federal Reserve has issued multiple reports warning about how if crypto becomes more entrenched in traditional financial markets, it could cause widespread chaos. And I've had multiple experts tell me and sources tell me that like these reports echo similar ones about the right before the 2008 financial crisis. And Republicans are rolling back all types of regulations that barred crypto from working with banks. Trump's new SEC got rid of a staff bulletin. It was staff alert bulletin 121, I think is what it was. And it did many things. And one of the things it did is that in a roundabout way essentially blocked banks from stockpiling massive crypto reserves or holding crypto reserves on behalf of their customers. Well, that's now going away. So banks can now have access to these extremely volatile, digital assets that are poorly regulated. They've been around now for like 15 years. And like what the main thing that they've proven to be good at is, avoiding sanctions and tax purposes, so it's just one of those industries that is rife with fraud and scams. There's an ungodly amount of money involved in it. And instead of taking a strong stance against it, they're more than happy to take campaign dollars from, all different types of like industry groups.
Yeah, that was Kamala's outreach to Black voters.
Which is insane. Yeah, like truly insane. Yeah. And the crypto industry holds up these internal reports that they do about how marginalized groups are using crypto as like an alternative to a bank, which isn't an alternative to a bank. It's just like one big scam. You buy it when it's low and you try to find some sucker to sell it to when it's high.
She could do free public banking. She could pick up on some of those Bernie era policies instead. Or what was it, postal banking rather.
I know this isn't a breaking news podcast, but I can tell you in the last 5 minutes that a federal judge has temporarily blocked the pause on these federal payments. So, and that's a result of a lawsuit that was filed by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and others who were not going to get payments through this action. So, things are starting to happen. But I'll also give you an example.
David, is that like step one? Would that be step one in what you were talking about?
Yeah, it's a temporary injunction.
In getting it to the Supreme Court, though?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the road that we're heading down, but at least people will be held harmless in the interim. But I'll give you an example, and I think this will play, Bree, into your cynical viewpoints. Sean Duffy, who is one of these nominees, like one of the reasons why the Senate is a venue here where you could engage in some resistance is that Trump wants something out of the Senate, right? He wants his cabinet officials confirmed. And Sean Duffy is the nominee for Department of Transportation, I'm sorry. And he was, as I said, there are two votes. There's a vote to end debate, and then there's a vote to actually advance the individual and confirm them. So in the vote to end debate, Duffy yesterday, before this whole thing came out about the pause, got a 98-0 vote in the U.S. Senate. Then the pause happens, and a lot of Democrats are like, we can't consent to continue operating the way that we've been operating if this is what's happening by the Trump administration. So they tried to convince all the Democrats to vote against, sort of symbolically, but because it only takes 50 votes to pass somebody. But just as an example of the beginning of the escalation of this, that they won't consent. They got 22 out of the 47 Democrats to agree to that. Half the Democrats would not agree to even symbolically register dissent with a program that renders them essentially irrelevant as a lawmaking body. So if you want to be the cynic, there's the way to be the cynic about this.
This is what I'm saying. And specifically, I think you were asking like what my view is of why these resistance cycles happen the way they do and people go back to brunch and why there's this sort of frustration that, we didn't fix it last time. I wouldn't say it's so much like instant gratification culture or whatever, millennials and Gen Z just being like on their phones or whatever. Quite to the contrary.
I wasn't trying to say that.
Well, I'm overstating your case, of course. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be hyperbolic.
I might have been not great in saying what I was trying to say, but go ahead.
But I think the people who are the know your rights people are exactly, I'm sorry, the same woke people who have consistently been focused on criminal justice, the real world, the real people have been harmed, not just because Trump is president, but under the Biden administration. And that those are the very people that get maligned, frankly, oftentimes by portions of the left media ecosystem that want to seem serious and tough on crime and not woke and blah, 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 blah. But those are the people who, because they do direct services, because themselves are low income and are harmed by a lot of these kinds of policies, recognize that it's not just a partisan game. And the reason that they seem to quote unquote go away, or there are some like more liberal types, keyboard pundits and the like, who do think along the lines of we should have done it, we should have fixed this already. It's because there's only an engagement with these sorts of things when they can attribute it to Donald Trump. And so this is part of why I wanted to get, if we can, just a little bit into this PodSafe clip, because you won't believe it when I tell you, you'll have to hear it for yourself, that one of the justifications that one of the PodSafe bros gives for why people shouldn't be so mad at Democrats right now and that Democrats are being unfairly impugned for why they lost, et cetera, it's because they're saying Trump kept his promises deporting people. Biden deported even more people than Trump. So why aren't folks happy? This is the argument that's being made. So let's listen to a little bit of this if we can before we wrap here.
I get why this went viral. I get that it resonates on an emotional level for some people because we're all mad at Democrats because we got our asses kicked and we're mad about the election. We're mad about Joe Biden. But he's just so wrong on so many different levels. I mean, Democrats didn't make the whole election about trans rights. Republicans ran tens of millions of dollars of attack ads on TV attacking Kamala Harris on this issue. That's why it was salient. And then Stephen A.
Well, because of what she said.
In 2019, not in 2024. And then Stephen A.'s definition of Trump keeping his promise is putting forward an executive order on birthright citizenship that he knows will get struck down in court. That is not how Joe Biden was judged. Like when Biden put forward a student loan forgiveness plan and it got struck down by a Republican Supreme Court, everyone got mad at Joe Biden and said he was feckless. Like, I'm not here to make excuses for Democrats or Biden or Harris or say the campaign was good, but it's like, it's a 50-50 electorate. There was an anti-incumbent wave. Trump is not delivering for the American people in some profound way right now. It's just all vibes. And like, I get the vibes and the anger driving them, but it's just like, he points to Ro Khanna as like, you might know all the details of the things Joe Biden promised and did deliver on. I didn't bother to Google them. And it's just like, come on, man.
Yeah, it's so frustrating, right? Because you see that clip and you're like, well, let's break it down, right? Let's explain all the ways that this is wrong, right? All the ways in which actually Joe Biden delivered on a lot of his promises. And Donald Trump failed in his first term on virtually every promise that he made, other than cutting taxes for the richest people. That Joe Biden had more deportations while he was president than Donald Trump had while he was president, right? There's a lot of ways to break it down. What was interesting to me about the clip is like when that you see like a kind of conventional wisdom kind of taking hold in real time, and you see like this like Bill Maher says exactly, and the whole audience applauds. And I've tried to think like if Kamala Harris had won, Like, what is the list of big executive orders she could have signed in the first day that would have had like rapturous applause? It was like, she's fucking doing it. She's delivering on what she said she's going to do. It's happening. It's happening. And like, that's not to say that like that part of that is just the failures of incumbency, right? Like,
well, I was going to say it would feel different because she would have taken office not after 4 years of the other party.
You just unravel what the other guy just did. That's what all these EOs are.
And there was a little bit of that when Biden won, right? And
tons.
then remember the first week Biden
got
did
back
a bunch
in Paris. Whee!
Yeah.
there was a
and boy, did that make a difference.
Fixed it.
but
No fires.
But the reason I bring that up is only to say, like, yes, it is different when you're trying to run to replace someone in your own party versus replace someone in the opposite party. But like, I think back to 2006, and I remember all the Democrats campaigning for the House, and they had their like checklist of the things that they were going to do if they won, and the things that were going to stop it. They did the anti-corruption measures, raising the minimum wage. There's a whole list of simple to understand policies.
Okay, so a couple of things there. You heard the little immigration point, but what is the answer to that question? What is the list of big executive orders that Kamala Harris could have done on day one that might have engendered the same amount of excitement and commitment to her, or Biden for that matter? What are the big list of executive orders that he could have put into effect that would have had Democrats punching the air the way Republicans are right now?
David, before you give like a very nice, thorough, detailed answer, I'll just say like I have no idea, Bree. Like I don't even really know what like Kamala ran on. You know, I'm a reporter. I'm supposed to cover this stuff, and like her whole thing was just a match of like, you know, like not taking a strong stance on anything. I mean, there's certain things I would like to see get done, but I mean, would she sign those? Probably not. But yeah, so. I mean, I'm not quite sure what those would be.
I mean, even
right
look at this inflation eggs point. I think I alluded to this in a previous episode, but Trump was floating, again, he floats a lot of things, but floating discussions about price controls and forcing the Fed to lower interest rates, which were things when they were brought up when Biden was president, which were, oh my gosh, that's not decorum. That's not the way we do things. And if we talk about price controls, we're going to be dirty commies and everyone's going to call us a socialist and we'll never win Florida or whatever the arguments are. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Freddie.
No. Yeah, I guess you know, attacking big business, going, you know, being like, you know, even stronger on the antitrust would have been some great things to see, you know, one of those two issue. But, you know, it's like Harris ran her campaign largely like, you know, trying to step away from like Lena Khan, trying to step away from like antitrust regulation.
Yes, she would not commit to retaining her. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's like, that's where I was saying, it's like, I'm not quite sure what what you would even to expect from her, because the popular things that like her, you know, the base wanted to get done, she stepped away from. You know, it's like, you know, Biden to, you know, his credit, they did a number of like good things when it came to like consumer protection. You know, Rohit Chopra has been doing a great job over there. Lena Khan did a great job. Jonathan Cantor did a great job. But you never really saw them, you know, Biden or Kamala talk about those things. And those were some of the most popular things that administration did. And
because they had Mark Cuban and a bunch of billionaire investors in their ear who didn't think those were great things.
Or as we reported on, you had Tony West, you know, whatever executive of Uber, talking, and Kamala's brother-in-law talking in her ear during the campaign. At the same time, Lena Khan was investigating Uber for, you know, antitrust stuff. And so, yeah, like she just became so embedded with like, you know, to use one of Trump's terms, the swamp and like the swamp creatures of
I think that's a really important point. And one of the big ticket items here is that when we're talking about executive orders is student debt. Student debt advocates, the Debt Collective and elsewhere, have been saying very loudly that Biden could have pushed through, just immediately signed an executive order canceling all student debt on day one had he wanted to. And it is difficult for me to reconcile that, which is, of course, has been debated by Biden acolytes. I'll try to find a softer word for it, but people who are very, very pro-Biden, defensive of the Biden campaign. But when you see what Trump has managed to do, I mean, we're talking about federal debt that the government truly controls and holds, and that Trump put on a moratorium for years and years during COVID. And the argument was that Biden is too weak to cancel student debt, but Trump is strong enough to get rid of birthright citizenship. I mean, what do you make of that, David? The claim in the clip was that it's going to be struck down by the courts. But given all that we've said about the partisan nature of the Supreme Court, should we be worried about this?
What are you talking about? Birthright citizenship?
The birthright citizenship issue, yeah.
I think that's...
expand on whatever.
I actually think that's kind of a bit of a piece of candy for the Supreme Court. Like, yeah, this is a big fat pitch across the plate, and we can show our independence by not giving Trump what he wants on birthright citizenship while waving through a bunch of other stuff. I feel like this is going to be the thing that launches 1,000 op-eds about how John Roberts is actually a great savior of the American Republic. So yeah, I think you got to kind of pick your spots there in terms of what you're thinking about. But I mean, let's be clear on a couple things. Number one, the very first executive order that Trump issued on January 20th was a rescinding of 78 Joe Biden executive orders, right? 42% of the executive orders that Joe Biden put in. So it's not like there was nothing there that Joe Biden did. They literally, Trump was like, don't do the 78 things that Joe Biden told you to do. The second thing is, I mean, look, I feel like that we've tracked this pretty well throughout Biden's 4 years. We did a project called the Day One Agenda, where we came up with hundreds of executive actions that the Biden administration could have done. And in the final analysis, it's something like half that they did of what we suggested, which is, probably to the left of what the mainstream of the party would have suggested. So, and for better or worse, Biden put in place those individuals at the FTC, at CFPB, at the DOJ. And actually what was really interesting was when practically everybody else in government had checked out after the election, we're basically just marking time and getting their offices packed up. In the last 3 weeks, FTC, DOJ, and CFPB put forward a multitude of other actions, lawsuits, settlements, final rules that all amounted to probably as much. I mean, setting aside some of the really egregious things that Trump has done, I would say that the actions that FTC, DOJ, and DOJ antitrust, to be clear, and CFPB took at the end of the Biden cycle were actually more impactful than the things that Trump has done in the first week. Are they
getting undone though, or are they the kinds of things that will stick?
Some of the things can't be undone because they're partnerships with states. So they sued John Deere for not allowing individuals to repair their own farming equipment. That was done in conjunction with Illinois and Minnesota. So they can't undo that case because that case would go forward with the states. The same thing applies to a case against RealPage, which is this rental pricing algorithm that a bunch of landlords use to raise prices across rental markets. They actually included 6 new defendants in that case, including one that turned state's evidence that actually is operating on behalf of the Federal Trade Commission, or actually on behalf of the Justice Department Antitrust Division in that case. A lot of the rules that were put forward actually had bipartisan support. So it's an interesting situation where you had a few. I mean, here's the thing: the federal government, the percentage of the federal government budget at those 3 agencies is about 0.005% of the federal budget, right? And yet the work product that those 3 agencies did is about 50% of what was done in the Biden administration. This is in many ways the problem.
That's what's so frustrating. Yeah. The idea that the Biden administration
there are only a few people willing to
defend farmers, against predatory corporations that wouldn't let them fix their own tractors. That's a win. That's a narrative win. But it gets buried in December of 2024, and it's not something that anybody can run on, and it's not, that is exactly the problem. A demonstration, and at the end of your lame duck term, that you could have done something that could have prevented you from being a lame duck and that could have turned you into an incumbent is exactly what's so mind-blowing.
I would agree with you to an extent. One problem is antitrust takes a lot of time, and they were doing these things to get them done before the regime changed over. Now, where I would totally agree with you is a perfect example of this is the Friday before Joe Biden leaves office, he issues this proclamation that the Equal Rights Amendment is actually the law of the land. Now, he doesn't do any of the steps that you would have to take to make the Equal Rights Amendment the law of the land. You notice you haven't heard that since the moment that he said it. But he just wanted to, like, for the history books, get this weird narrative win to say that I was the one who said that the Equal Rights Amendment is the law of the land. You had 1,400 days to actually get work done on that if you thought that that was actually the case. And so there, presidencies are multitudes. There are people who actually care about governing. There are people in presidencies who don't care about governing. And I think that ultimately, considering that Joe Biden's entire purpose of becoming president was to win the battle for the soul of America, you'd have to say he was a failed president on those terms because he did not win that battle. I mean, the point I was making to bring up Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor and Rohit Chopra was that it's kind of like that joke about the black box in the plane. When the plane goes down, people say that, well, there's this black box that's indestructible and it has all the information in it. So why don't you make the plane out of the black box? Why don't you make the plane out of Lena Khan, Rohit Chopra, and Jonathan Cantor? In other words, why isn't everyone in the government looking for every last way to benefit the public on every day of their time in office rather than just them?
And I think I know what my answer to that would be, which is that there's an extreme conflict of interest within the corporate Democratic Party that, of course, was not gung-ho about Lena Khan. And there was very much a battle, as evidenced that we alluded to before, that Kamala Harris would not confirm that she would retain Lena Khan in that position because of how much pressure she was under to do the opposite. We have to go. So I won't play it. We'll insert it for the audience. But I wondered if you guys had seen this video that Ro Khanna and some others were championing as sort of the good vision for the future. It's a commercial by some group called Fight Agency that centered John Fetterman, of all people, along with, I think, the mayor of Atlanta and a couple of others as the future of the Democratic Party. There's some Bernie Sanders populism sprinkled in there. I would argue too little too late for good measure.
You good?
Let's go.
Action.
This is why people hate politics.
Donald Trump will become the 47th president.
Republicans will pull off a political trifecta, controlling the House, the Senate, and the White House.
How can the left possibly come back from this?
Part of his rise, a creative ad campaign.
Tenacious, focused, unstoppable.
If you're doing everything right,
I'm never giving up. I'm never going to forget.
But find it harder and harder to get by.
These folks have been chanting every county, every vote.
You're not alone.
Won in a landslide.
He's straight up. He cares about the people. The only thing that can stop them is us.
When you're poor, you really need a belief in a better future.
As all the attacks come at me, they don't understand what fire I come from.
My phone exploded last night. People said, you have to see this ad.
But that seems to be the plan. Talking about the price of eggs, talking about John Fetterman as the future of the Democratic Party, and some sanguine quotes from Hakeem Jeffries about how at least we can all still go to church/brunch on Sunday. How are you guys feeling? I want to give you a chance to have some last words and to tell the people where to find you and your work on the internet and beyond. We'll start with you, Freddie.
Yeah, that just kind of reminds me of, FDR and the New Deal. And, FDR said, we can either have fascism or the New Deal and these new policies. And at the time, the Democratic Party and the American populace chose the New Deal. When that presented itself again, in the late 2010s with Trump and Bernie was rising, We had the opportunity to choose New Deal policies, which aren't radical, really. It's not like we're issuing like full communism in the United States. It's essentially just giving power back to the middle class. You had a candidate who championed that, and he was drugged through the mud. He was slandered and just, had everything lined up against him. And so the Democratic Party chose to ally itself with big money, big tech, and other corporate interests rather than advocating on behalf of the working class in this country. And they used every sort of tactic you can imagine to, take down what they perceive to be a threat to their, bottom line, to the dollars. And so, when it comes to, advancing a new vision into the future with John Fetterman or these other people, I hope it involves some sort of New Deal policies, but I'm not going to hold my breath and think John Fetterman is going to champion those policies.
Yeah. And Freddie, where can people find you at The Lever and beyond, Twitter, etc.?
Yep. I'm on Twitter at, I think it's just Freddy_Brewster. And then, just find our work at levernews.com. And, we're putting out all types of great stuff lately.
You really are. Thank you so much for all your reporting. And same question to you, David. Any last words, and where can people find you?
Well, I'm starting to remember what Trump news cycles look like, and the policy happens at the speed of light, and we have to move in that same direction. And so the first week of when all these executive actions were happening, we basically turned the Prospect into a blog, and we ran over 40 stories about these actions and what they actually meant, whether they mattered, who was benefiting. And that's the kind of accountability journalism that we're going to keep doing. It's prospect.org, and you can go there and hopefully find out, as much as you need as a tool for activists and people like yourself, Brianna, to hold accountable, regardless of party, the leadership that is really out there and affecting Americans on a daily basis.
Yeah, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. People in this big pundit YouTube ecosystem, at least anyone running north or salt, would be completely made impotent without the real reporting that's done at outlets like the American Prospect and The Lever. Like, honestly, I cannot stress enough that if you subscribe to a patron for your, me or your favorite kind of independent journalist, really, really consider funding the news orgs that are enabling all of these journalists to cover such a wide breadth of stories in such comprehensive detail, without which we truly would not know what's going on. I don't care if it's a recurring donation is too much of a commitment. If it's a one-time donation, do what you can do. But genuinely consider the benefit that you're getting from these outlets and the work that these people are doing. And it might not be as flashy as a 10-minute direct-to-camera video or a TikTok about how so-and-so is shitty and this TYT person is fighting with that, whatever. But without this stuff, we know nothing, and we are so vulnerable. And so I really do want to emphasize that. And thank you both for all of your reporting and for taking the time to be with us here today.
You got it, Bree. Thanks.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, thank you, Bree.
Take care, both of you. And to all you listeners, remember to take care of yourselves and keep the faith. If you want more Bad Faith podcasts, you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for an additional video and audio episode that drops on Mondays. Take care. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.